Okay, good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Hey, we're only 33 minutes late. You want to know why?
Sure.
I just totally screwed up. I
Oh,
just like totally. I can't even say I was out on a great run in the snow of the Rockies. I can't say I was like, fulfilling services for a client or maybe digging up new prospects and money. I was basically like running an errand and farting around. I got back and I said, I waved at my wife and I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm like a half an hour late for the meeting." And she goes, "Didn't you set the meeting up?" And okay, I did.
yeah,
I
that is an interesting point, John. You
Yeah,
are
I
the
know.
person who set
And
the
so
meeting time. Yeah.
and so my reason for a public mea culpa on this before we get to the item of the day is if we had sponsors or
Oh,
advertisers or subscribers, I would feel really guilty. I mean, because they would be, I assume, wanting some service for their advertising sponsor or subscription
yeah.
or membership. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to make money in the world, and I would feel like I failed them. But we are doing this pro bono, where this is our volunteer effort, and
Yeah.
I feel a little guilty because I don't like wasting your time, but
Well,
but I don't feel really guilty. At some point, if we get a subscriber, I hereby promise to be on time.
yeah. Well, friends are allowed to waste my time, but if I don't like you, then you
Fair
don't
enough.
need to waste my time. Yeah.
And for the record, you did this once too. So we are even now. We are 1-1. Out of 100
Okay.
shows, we've each screwed up once. So,
But
um,
you'll notice in all of our chats, I can't, but this is the most boring thing to talk about in the world. But like, I always put this time Mountain, this time Pacific, and it's
I,
not for you, it's for me because
oh, I do it too. No, I
constantly
do.
translating it into Pacific, you know.
I did that today on the even on the email, the private email
Yeah,
chatting, and I still screwed up. It is a weird mea culpa or a
it
weird
happens.
weird
Time zones
fault.
are hard. Yeah.
I apologize, everyone, especially to Andrea. I can't believe you're still here. Welcome. This is only your first or second or third show you've been to. And Bart, I apologize to you as well. Jake, I know you're leaving in about 20 minutes. So, all right, Professor.
Hit me.
Um, this is a conglomeration of two or three conversations we've had in the past. If we had a researcher on our team besides Jake doing it right when we're doing it, we could combine these shows and not even do today's show. But the reason I wanted to talk about this today is it looks like there's a presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, and it looks like there's a presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, and I haven't voted yet. And so I'm a little irritated, but then I remember I'm not even a member of that private political club. So why should I be irritated at all? Well, because Colorado state law allows me to vote as an unaffiliated voter. So now I'm irritated again. But on the other hand, no, they're private clubs. And why should I be all bent out of shape? And all my Democratic friends are just thinking the world is ending because Trump's going to be the nominee and he has a chance of winning. And all my Republican friends are just like not madder than hell because they'd tell me if they were madder than hell and if they were a true friend that the border is just there's hundreds of thousands of people coming across the border, and that's just as bad as the constitutional violations that Trump has made. That we're not securing the border. We're not can't be a country like this if we're just gonna and we're gonna go broke because of deficit spending. And John, you really are a Republican. No, you're not. You can't be in favor of Biden over Trump if because our country's being ruined. And everybody says we're all gonna get violent and mad at each other. And fortunately, mad and violent, and I guess it would be that order. Fortunately, you and I have talked about this, and you said, "No, John, settle down." Um, it's not that bad. There's some concerning things, but we're a rational country. So anyway, that's my premise of this conversation about what's the role of citizenship in a presidential election, in the most important election ever. This next year, 2024. If you read my post on Facebook, I'm predicting the Republican Party is going to disintegrate over this, or be so. It's just incompatible. There's no way real conservatives and whatever these new people are can be in the same party because they're opposites. Anyway, that's the premise of today. And the Democrats are going to do the same thing in a couple of years. Tell me from a historian's perspective. Wow, John, you're a mess. You're late and you're just threw all this stuff out at me. Tell me what you're thinking about the election of 2024.
About the election or
Yeah, and citizens' role. Yeah, I mean, how should we be thinking about this?
Uh,
Go any direction you want.
all right. Let me. I guess I don't. There are a couple of premises in your prologue that I don't
Yeah.
necessarily. I won't say I disagree with them, but I just don't know that they are facts.
Argue
Um,
away or make points.
yeah. For instance, I don't know if we're living in divisive times or if we are being or if we are falsely divided by um, how we discuss political issues. Um, so I, I'm trying to think of how to approach this issue. All right, here you go. I'm wearing an Ohio sweatshirt right here. And this morning, my son was telling me that he had a youth group meeting last Wednesday that really rocked his world because they were asking him, they were just, the subject was how do we love differently? You know, how do we love different? And this morning, I was talking to my son about memories. Uh, and how we process and store memories and make decisions. And then I put on this sweatshirt, and I immediately remembered that I bought this sweatshirt the second day I was in Ohio. Uh, uh, you know,
For your PhD?
yeah, I got into Athens, Ohio, and stayed at the Thunderbird Motel. And then the very next day, I found a place to live, walked downtown, went into the bookstore, and bought this sweatshirt in, whatever that was, August of 1998, so I've had this sweatshirt for a long time, I don't even think of it as being old. The old stuff is the stuff that I still have from college, right?
Right.
Uh, so, eh, eh, and all this is to say, one thing jogs a memory. Uh, and we've talked in past episodes about how um, working in politics in the nitty gritty of politics, you use the word street fighter all the time, but I just mean like in the local level, the bump and and
Yeah.
and and I often say, and I think you agreed with this, but if it takes more than 3 words, you've lost the argument.
Oh
The
gosh. So all my premise I've lost, huh?
yeah, that essentially, if it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, you can't really explain it in the heat of a campaign. Uh, but that's because labels trigger memories, and stories are how we make decisions. So when one candidate applies a label to themselves, what that does to most voters is it triggers a larger story. And if I were to diagnose the biggest cultural problem that we have, it's probably uh, a credentialism that is based on systems that have grown up that will reward someone who pretends to solve a problem. Uh, you
Explain
want me to say that
credentialing.
again, or I can either say it again or I can start to explain it. Uh,
Okay, well, keep going.
okay. And what I mean by this is that um, I can't talk about some of this stuff because it involves like work and personnel type stuff. But, in California, we have this DEI policy, right? And um, in uh, and if all you mean by the word diversity is what everybody means by diversity, then I'm for it.
Right.
And if what you mean by equality is nothing more than what everybody means by equality, I'm for it. And if what you mean by inclusivity is nothing more than having a culture where people feel comfortable and positive in their learning environment and in their work environment, I'm for it.
What about equity?
Well,
You
that's
said equality.
you're right, but I would just remind people that in the English language and in the law, there's no difference between equality and equity.
Ah, interesting.
That's a false definition that has been created as part of a political agenda. Like
That's
they're
helpful for me to think through because I don't have a problem with equity for my legal training. I don't
right.
know.
That's
I
what
don't.
I mean. Like you sue on the basis of equity, but you see that
Yeah,
it's actually means equality. They mean the same thing in the law.
interesting point. Good.
Um, so there are people who take each of those words and attach a political agenda to each one of them that is, in fact, the opposite of what the word actually means. Um, and um, all it does is serve to remind me that if you were to ask the average American about something like, for instance, you mentioned the border, your buddies talking about the border. Well, all the reporting says that this border deal is something that is everything the Republicans want. And so President Trump is lobbying against it because he doesn't want to give Joe Biden the victory. And it's essentially what the Democrats did with the Dream Act. You know, in other words, what you have are some people who don't actually want to solve the problem. What they want is they want to not solve the problem and then have the label to use as a political issue against their enemies. And I would say that is almost a mirror image of what I call credentialism. You know, this thing where people care more about being on the right side or assigning themselves, virtue based on having the right labels. They care more about that than they care about actually solving any kind of problem. In other words,
Okay, so
yeah.
Professor, I
What does
get.
this have to do with the election? I
No,
guess.
no, no, no.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to ask a question right on point. I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
I get an individual who wants a title for ego or pride or power or money or retirement or bennies. I get that. And I also get all the hangers on because they also have power, prestige, ego, money, retirement. I mean, I get there's several thousand people associated with the presidency, direct appointments.
yeah,
And of course, you're not going to disagree with the boss, especially a firm boss. There may be a wise, magnanimous boss. What is that? Rivals of, enemies of rival. That there may be some types of leaders that are comfortable with that, but most people don't like being criticized, and especially publicly. So if you have an employee that's going to criticize you, you're not going to hire them if you know that in advance, or if they do hire you, you'll probably let them go because your reputation and pride and retirement and ego and all that. I get several thousand people being engaged in just saying yes, sir. I get the military hierarchy structure. It's not your job to be the commander in chief. It's not your job to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Secretary of Defense. You're a private, thank you, or you're a captain. I mean, I get hierarchies, but I'm not sure I understand citizens. Just somebody who's got a job and a spouse and a kids and a house or a condo or an apartment. I don't know. They're just in some hobbies or not. Maybe they just watch TV. I don't get them getting all bent out of shape over all this stuff. I get several thousand, and I even get governors and several hundred more. And I get the political pack activists. I get the 527s, and I get the fundraisers. Okay, now that we're talking tens of thousands of people in the country that are insiders. You and I have both been in that kind of group at different periods of our lives. I don't get the millions or the tens of millions or the hundreds of millions getting all bent out of shape. That's what I don't get. So tell me
Well,
about.
if you don't like the word systemic, it's a big word. I won't use it again. Let's
Okay.
use big evil. Big evil happens not because of everyone is evil. Big evil happens because of bad intentions, understandable intentions, and good intentions. Uh,
Okay.
so
Hmm.
I guess I can talk about Nazis or I can talk about DEI, but if you think about why something bad happens, there are a handful of people who have legitimately bad intentions, and and then
Let's talk about
actually
January 6th.
Right. So a handful of people have genuinely bad intentions. They're doing it
Yeah.
for the wrong reasons. Um, but in addition to that, though, there are people who are, I guess you say ignorant, but let's set them aside, really.
But in a Mark Twain kind of way, not a horrible, just they just
No,
don't
I
know
just
better.
mean that like 10% of the people are
Yeah.
probably, there's no, you know, you can't convince them, you can't talk to them or whatever. Not in the people who would actively reject evidence.
Hmm.
So, 90% of the population is by some measure reasonable, right? So let's talk within that 90%, there are some people who have a bad intention, but people who have a bad intention have almost this superpower. Uh, and it's called, in its worst form, terrorism.
Hmm.
And as I was explaining in my classes last week, the way lynchings worked is that you don't have to kill everybody in order to scare everybody. You just have to demonstrate your intent and that you're not scared of, being punished, and this is what will happen to you. So again, a kind of real life example that I'll make vague enough that I'm not breaking any laws, but
Back
there
to
was
DEI.
yeah, but there was um, an assertion made, uh, and then some statements that weren't exactly threatening, but it indicated that if you um, disagreed on this issue, you were going to get labeled and you were going to be attacked. And, you know, it would sure be a shame if something happened to your class schedule. And or if a Twitter mob might come after you, or I'm going to tell this foundation that you're, oh, and by the way, we're going to try and become the net. We're going to reduce the number of whatever, so it actually cuts your pay, and you're going to be accused of being a racist. Like, and it's like, wow, well, did they commit an act of violence? No, but they certainly created an incentive to just go along, to keep your mouth shut, right? And so the people who keep their mouths shut, they're not bad people. They're people who have mortgages, you know, and people who are scared. And by their very nature, most bureaucrats are just scared. They want the problem to go away more than they care about, making something better. And then even people with good intentions, and in this case, I have a lot of friends who would say, "Oh, what's the problem?" They think that they're being nice. They moderate. They have a moderating instinct, and they are trying to see the other perspective. And they say, well, we should just go along with this because, if you define the words this way, then it doesn't mean those things. But, in this case, I think they're being hopelessly naive. It, it's like there are people who believe that they can negotiate with terrorists, you know, um, and I would just say, there's a long history of negotiating with dictators and terrorists, um, where it doesn't go well over the long term.
So
Um,
what you're
yeah,
trying
go
to give
ahead.
examples of both the macro and the micro. So like on your terrorist example, it's the same thing as a burglar in your home. Some of them are really bad people and they'll hurt or kill you or rape you. Other people might just be really hungry and desperate. And so the same act going on in your home. And some people might go, well, I'm not going to report it, or I don't know if they're breaking in or not. Maybe they're bad or maybe they're good. It's none of my business.
Yeah.
So that's the micro or the macro terrorism and what's going on in Hamas in Israel. Is that right? Am I following you?
Yeah, or the American South, or in a
Yeah.
boardroom,
Or
or even
or in a college university.
yeah, and it and
Yeah.
it it ends up, and these things don't end up being a big deal when they start. So even moderate or nicely inclined people would sort of say, okay, well, it seems like a moderate position. And then you wake up 25 or 30 years later and you realize, like, oh my gosh, this whole institution is being run by terrorists. And I don't mean literal terrorists,
Right,
but
right,
people
right.
who uh, got their positions by threatening people and who have done no work and are not interested in actually solving problems and just having the right labels. And I would say that is a big problem because for the average citizen, if you think about where the average citizen is going to get their information, well, you have a base of knowledge about what you're supposed to be as an American. Well, that's gone. And that base of knowledge is supposed to be informed by media sources. Well, that's gone. So what are you left with if you're a regular person? And this is why for somebody who went to school in the 70s or 80s or even the early 90s, the world can seem very confusing right now. You wake up one day and you say, why are all these professors acting like this? Why is it what the New York Times is doing what? And you just can't believe that the words that are coming out of people's mouths. But what this does for your average citizen is it leaves your average citizen no choice but to become a reactionary. And something that Professor Brasino said that I know I've quoted on here more than one time is, and it just is so simple. This is what he's good at, is every now and then he comes up with like a little pithy thing. It's like perfect. But he said, "Oh, you must love Trump because this is how you get more Trump." you know and every time I'm in a meeting, I can't help but think, I'm running it in the back of my mind as these people are saying these completely outrageous things. I think, oh, you must love Trump because doing this kind of stuff
It's
is what
creating.
makes people feel like it doesn't matter who I vote for, so I just need a strong daddy who's against you. you know Regular people feel like, and I'm kind of, I'm I'm stepping out here and
Right.
speculating, but like I think that regular people feel like they have no choice but to vote for a reactionary, and that is a big problem. But we can't fix culture and we can't fix institutions overnight. Um, I would, but I would say the first step to fixing culture and institutions is to do what Hiram Lewis said to do on this podcast, also webcast. Um, get past, instead of asking people to bend the knee about your bumper sticker, ask them what they want to accomplish. Ask them what they really want.
Well, gosh, there's so many. I threw out a bunch of stuff at you, and you've kind of
Sorry, I
coalesced.
didn't know how you
No,
wanted me
but
to.
coalesced an area for us to discuss, which is nice. But there's still a lot to hang on there, so I'm not even sure where to go. But let me interrupt ourselves first with Jake. You have to leave in another 5 or 6 minutes. Is this too convoluted of a conversation for you to jump in now before you leave, or I'm giving you a chance to jump in? You don't have to take it.
I mean, I don't know how much more I can add to it. I mean, most of the people I spend my days with are high school students who, as soon as they graduate in May, will be eligible to vote in November.
That
And I,
scares you.
it does, well, I mean, it doesn't scare me that they're going to vote because even though I repeatedly tell my students to vote, I know that probably 99% of them are not going to vote in November.
Really? That is so weird to me. I don't
They
get that.
do not care, John.
How is that possible? I was so excited to vote when I was 18.
I
I was,
know, but you also turned 18 probably in the 90s, back
yeah,
before,
I'm in 80s. I voted for Reagan, baby.
okay, good for you, John. But before social media made everyone depressed, like I tell my students what the national debt is every single day. I pull up the debt clock and I show them the national debt is now $34 trillion. By the time I get done speaking, it will go up probably another $100 million.
Oh yeah, but you got to tell them that each one of them owes $50,000, and they're not going to get any services for it. They just owe on it.
Well, and then I tell them about Social Security and how that's going to run out in 2037 and how their paychecks are going to go to
Well, now
fund their grandparents and my parents' retirement. And I tell them that neither political party cares to solve the issue. And so that's why they should vote for better candidates. And then when I cut them loose to work on stuff independently, they get out their phones and they get on social media.
Okay,
I think,
Professor.
yeah, I think he's right in a certain sense that, like, for the vast, if you really wanted people to riot, take away uh, corn syrup, sugary drinks, salty snacks, and TikTok. Uh, because I think that the vast majority of people would say to themselves, I don't really care what goes on in the entire world as long as I have TikTok and um, like fast food and sugary drinks, like, because
Also,
that's their
you know,
values have been reoriented.
that rings true to me, but I also have this feeling to say, like, you guys are a bunch of old men. Hey, kids, get off my lawn.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, I mean, I always thought that was a strange analogy because the guy saying "get off my lawn" is like, might be right. I don't. It depends on who's on his lawn, but
but Professor, thanks, Jake. Professor, you're more upbeat on your students. You're kind of down on the administration or maybe the educational bureaucracy of California,
well,
but
I
you're
guess I
kind of
have
up
to.
on your
I
students,
mean,
aren't you?
I say my students, but like, I don't know. When I say my students, I'm really talking about a third of my students.
Yeah,
Half the people who walk into a class drop it, you know, and
yeah.
or fail, or and like, it's a cross section of humanity. There are a lot of people who, I mean, because I have so many students, I know that, for instance, next week, um, and I have to keep reminding myself of the numbers, but like, the first paper I'm going to assign, there are going to be 20 or 40 students who just plagiarize on
Yeah,
purpose. They cheat on purpose, and I have to keep telling myself, oh, it's still just a tiny number and whatever. But
right.
like, honestly, like, yeah, there are a lot of people who, I mean, if you think about what plagiarism is, it's credentialism. I want the reward for having done something that I didn't do.
Without the work, yeah, you just want
Yeah,
something.
but at the same time, um, if you know that it's politically and economically advantageous, but to preserve your own privileges, it's the same. It's kind of the same thing.
Let me take this angle
They-
for a second.
a bunch of slave owners in the 1680s. um, what did they really want to do? They wanted to preserve their own privileges. So what did they do? Find some sort of new argument for how we can justify a system that helps me preserve my own privilege. So if you ask me, like, do I understand this impulse among people? Oh, yeah, yeah. It's what led to racism and slavery and, lynchings in World War II. And yeah, it's part of the human brain. It's how we process information. Like, it's not something you can, you can't do anything about this natural human inclination. What you can do is teach people and create a culture that says we don't value that.
Okay,
You're a football fan, right? You
what's
love
that?
you like the Broncos? Are you a Broncos fan?
Everyone likes the Broncos. It's a
Okay.
Colorado
Well,
one.
within the Broncos world, Mike Shanahan was the coach of the Broncos, and
Yeah, I still have the steakhouse just a couple of miles
yeah,
from my house.
and his son Kyle Shanahan is now the
Yeah,
coach of the greatest football franchise in human history. And uh, Steve Young, the great NFL
yeah,
quarterback, last week, I think, interviewed Brock Purdy, who is the current
yeah.
49ers quarterback. And Steve Young kept asking Brock Purdy questions about, like, how do you manage to shake off a bad performance? And Brock Purdy kept saying, my ego is not based on this world. My system of values, like what he said, actually something pretty close to like what God has called me to do is just happens to be the quarterback of the 49ers right now. But like, that's not who I am. That's not where my life derives value from. And so he's like, this is just where I am called to be at a specific moment. but that's someone who has oriented their values in such a way that, and Steve Young kept saying, this is like a superpower. Like this is like a superpower. If your entire world is TikTok videos and somebody criticizes you in a TikTok video, well, then your life is out of control and you spiral into a depression. But if you're somebody like Eddie Murphy, who has never learned how to use a computer, he has no idea when people criticize him.
Yeah. Yeah. He just doesn't care. Doesn't know. It's a
Yeah, he
superpower.
doesn't care. He doesn't know about it, and he can get on with his life. How the individual orients their values is can, especially when it seems out of step with whatever
Okay.
you're into.
Let me
can seem to-
pierce this. Let me pierce this conversation, trying to listen to you,
Yeah,
and pierce it with a notion.
yeah.
So to know me, um, you'd have to kind of go back what I believed in and how I was raised. So family, and it was a fairly stable, really stable. But I'm sure they had problems. But mom and dad, brothers and sisters. But Boy Scouts. I mean, it was an integral part of my life. So when we talk well, all these conversations are probably based more off of my citizenship in the country and ecology merit badge. I mean, all these stuff I learned in the
How
Boy
you
Scouts. I didn't
orient your
play
values.
school. I didn't
Yeah.
learn it in school. I learned it in Boy Scouts, probably. I mean, and I still resonates with me today. Now, do I have trust in the Boy Scouts? Oh gosh, I don't know. There's been a lot of weird stuff in the Boy Scouts in the last couple decades. I found out. An Episcopal faith. I'm born, baptized, and confirmed an Episcopalian, and that going to the camps and the Sunday church schools and the studying to be confirmed. Boy, not the Episcopalian as much as the Roman Catholics, but boy, they've gone through some troubles, and also understanding ideology differences in the gay, anti-gay branches of the Episcopal faith. I mean, yikes! I thought that was all God related. Now I understand they hate each other over something like gays. Oh, interesting. Republican Party. I'm no longer Republican. I was born. Gosh, I spent 32 years of my life as a Republican, and now I'm not a Republican. And so anyway, and I'm not a good Episcopalian, and I'm not a good Boy Scout. So all of my fundamental faith growing up, heck, I'm kind of like one of these new kids. I don't have any of that anymore. So but I guess I had it though. I had the foundations of all those, and that gave me some stability that I can kind of look at it, not objectively, but look at it and go, yeah, I like that, and I don't like that, because I still view myself as an Episcopalian and a Boy Scout, and but I'm not, but I do. But if you don't have any of that, I guess I can see being lost.
Mhm.
Um, and frustrated with the Republican and Democratic Party or the so how do you be a good citizen today if most of those major structures, and you've talked education is gotten all weird. How do you become a good citizen today without those structures? And I know they all still exist, but not as much.
That's a good question. I mean, I guess I really go back to like the stuff that I tell my kids, which is surround yourself with um, the surround yourself with people of the highest character. You know, listen
Whether
to
they
what.
belong to an institution or not, just people of the highest
Yeah,
character.
yeah, and constantly be examining um, your own prejudices and belief systems, and then do everything you can to keep that compass arrow pointed at truth, and say that I'm going to. And I know we quote Coolidge a lot in this, but I think one of the most, I don't know, things that really resonated for me from Calvin Coolidge that he said once, and I'm paraphrasing this, is that essentially like every form of truth telling is a form of patriotism, because we believe that our political beliefs are actually true. We believe, and he said there's a finality about the Declaration that is exceedingly restful. And he said it, I believe it.
The
Like,
Declaration of
if
Independence.
I don't know what to do, I say, if all men are created equal, this is what Coolidge said, if all men are created equal, that is final. I need to start from that premise. And if somebody is like disagreeing with that premise, I need to make sure that my arrow is still pointed at, if all men are created equal, that is final. And the other thing that he said that is so brilliant in that same little sequence of sentences was there is no progress beyond that proposition. Everybody wants there to be something that's better than equality, and there isn't. Almost every form of evil comes from people wanting for there to be something better than equality, and there isn't something better.
Some power or prestige or money or fame or
Yeah.
something that.
I mean, he said, if all men are created equal, that is final. If they're endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If just government comes from the consent of the governed, that is final. And no progress can be made beyond those propositions. And anyone who wishes to deny their truth or their soundness cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. And what they are advocating is something more ancient, not more modern than what this country was founded upon.
Now, and so that gets back to our but I am adopting your philosophy because it seems sound to me, that of not liking the left or the right labels in America because they're both reactionary or maybe radical and reactionary, but they're both the antithesis of being an American. If you're willing to destroy the system in order to get your way, that's not going back to the Declaration, or as you and Coolidge seem to be adopting. Am I following you right?
Yeah, but I would just say, like, this is something that is practical that you can do in your everyday life. If you don't know what to do, you just say to yourself, like, well, what keeps my compass pointed at making sure that everyone has equality of opportunity? What is it that makes sure that every single person that we maintain this system of consent of the governed? What can we do that protects the rights of every American? And no matter what I'm hearing from any place else, I'm going to stick to those things.
Okay, so Professor, I hate to diverge our whole conversation on what citizenship is based on this, but I do want to probe because I actually think it kind of goes to the heart of the divisiveness in our country today. Mm-hmm. I like what you're saying. So thank you, Coolidge, and thank you for being a PhD and reading Coolidge and understanding this. And thanks for advocating that to our podcast. So thank you. But good meaning people, and I mean this, I say this all the time in our conversations, they're friends of mine. They're real people. They're not some made up wag trying to take my job or something. They're a friend and they're trying to live their life. Say, yeah, but the founders didn't believe that. They had slaves. And I start with the premise that let's just all start with the premise. If you've ever owned another human being, your opinion doesn't count. And I breathe and I kind of, if I'm Black, I kind of get what they're saying. If my ancestors were slaves and I was a bond slave, but that's different than being a slave. Okay, I guess after a lot of time listening to my liberal friends, not necessarily Black in that instance, but sometimes Black and liberal, at least I know where you're coming from. But how do I even have a conversation with you? How do we seek common ground or a bond when you think our country was founded on evil, when you're advocating that no, our country was founded on good? Now, some of them were founded on private property, viewing freedom in a different way. But I'll even accept that parts of our country were founded on evil or bad. But you can't say the whole country was. The first state that banned slavery was, I think, like a year before or after the founding of our country. I mean, so is that state evil? It just seems so simplistic to want to label a whole country bad, in my opinion. But I don't have that same critique of myself when I want to label the whole country good. So help me out on this. I know we've talked about this before, but because it gets the same thing on January 6th. It's the same exact conversation on January 6th or on DEI or on the border. It doesn't seem like we can solve problems. Help give some guidance on how we solve problems.
Well, I guess you have to first ask somebody, and this is the thing that sometimes becomes frustrating, is I've had these conversations with many people where you say, like, is there any evidence that I could provide you with that would change your mind? And really listen to the person's response. If they say yes, I'm willing to look at evidence, and then ask them, like, what would you be willing to accept as evidence? Let them set the terms of the debate almost on these issues. And then do your historical research, but don't do your historical research. This is the hard thing, is like it's almost like the way that people think about information and argumentation. No offense, John, is they all think like lawyers instead of historians.
Yeah.
Because
an advocate rather than a researcher.
Yeah, in other words, you start with a premise and then you go and find facts. And when you do that, you will always find facts that support what you say. Ideally, I won't say all historians do this, but like, ideally what we try to do is collect all the facts and tell that story. And then you will find out that the facts of the past didn't exist in order to help you win your argument. But you might find out that everybody has the wrong thesis and they're all asking the wrong questions. I start in a way, I've kind of let my students over the last 30 years create the outlines of my classes by what their questions are. And so, for instance, the questions that we get about slavery is, I start by saying, okay, we're not going to talk about all of slavery in the world. We're just going to talk about slavery just in the area of Africa that eventually the slaves that went to just the 13 colonies came from. And then they immediately stick up their hands and say, well, what are you talking about? There was slavery everywhere. And then you have to remind people, right. Essentially, there was no concept of human freedom, and that everyone came from a security relationship, human beings. There are two great, people say death and taxes are the great facts, but like, no. It's actually that every one of us is born dependent on others for our security, and every one of us is going to die someday. And if you know that, and you know that in the world before the United States existed, that everyone belonged to someone else as part of a security relationship. There was no
extended family. Extended family, right?
Right. There was no concept of peace or universal human rights, or that human life had any value at all outside of your immediate family and security relationships. And so, it's kind of like people assume now that peace is regular. It's like, no, all of the world was always at war. And the only thing that was called peace was like the time when one side had just won or lost. And winter was often a time of peace because it was difficult to fight in the winter. But like, that's very different from having the assumption that we live at peace. Anyway, what people will tell you when you have a chance in an actual classroom is they'll say, oh, like, I didn't realize a lot of my fundamental assumptions are incorrect. And that means that, we're so far away from talking about contemporary political issues, but they're starting to think, oh, I guess that means that everything I've been taught about every one of these issues is actually wrong. But you only get that from a study of history.
I'm trying to remember, and I took a couple of history classes in obviously high school, and I took I think one or two history classes in college versus political science classes. I don't remember, though, this discussion in any of that in high school or college, except for these conversations with you and then the book you recommended by, I think it was Morgan or Edmund
Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom.
Yeah, because what you're talking about resonates in that, because he goes into great detail about
Eric Foner. Yeah.
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 Does that sound right to you? That would that make sense that these were new concepts in just the last couple of years? I'm 57, so how could I be a 55-year-old and finally learn it from you and a couple books?
Yeah. I mean, I
Or
would say history had a bad 100-year run. Um, Starting, kind of um, between Woodrow Wilson and uh, you know, and it started getting better in the 70s and 80s, and then kind of got worse after the 1990s in some ways. But after the Civil War, um, uh, you had two groups of people who wanted to build some big lie. I mean, we've always had people who wanted to build big lies about American history. That's always been the case. And in some ways, it's always the same, kinds of groups of people. But, you know, um, when the country was founded, there were people who didn't like our Constitution, the kind of anti-federalists, and they wanted more majoritarian democracy. And meanwhile, in the South, there were people who wanted the Constitution to be pro-slavery. And so you kind of had these two groups of people who were both telling I mean, not a, they've had their own political agenda, and they wanted to read that political agenda into American history. And then after the Civil War, there are people who view the concentrations of wealth as bad, and they wanted to undo the Constitution because of that. They called themselves progressives, and they wanted to essentially undo the Constitution by, even inventing the living Constitution idea that you can ignore what it says and what it means and what it meant. I mean, because it no longer applies to modern conditions. Um, and then you also had racists in the South who were trying to recreate the conditions of slavery and racism, and they were all pushing for their political agenda and history writing. Um, and uh, None of that stopped in the in World War I. It accelerated under Woodrow Wilson, and then certainly in World War II, and in the years after World War II, the agendas changed a little bit. And even now, when I would say there's so much excellent um, history being produced, this excellent history that's being produced is almost never making its way into college classrooms, which kind of stunning. And it's certainly not making its way into high school classrooms. And Eric Foner can write all the books he wants, but it's not what's being taught. It's not what's being learned. Um, I mean, I can
uh,
list 100 historians who I think are fantastic, who everybody should be reading, but that stuff is
I,
just not making its way into the classrooms.
I'm taking too much time today because maybe Rick or Bart or
Yeah,
Andrea have
sorry.
some questions. But let me just ask a couple of summary questions. You're an optimist. You don't think there's going to be a violence or semi weird radical civil war kind of stuff around 2024. At least I asked the last time we asked you this, maybe 3 months ago. Have you changed your mind? Is it more? Are we more ripe for violence?
I don't think so, but this is the thing my caveat always is I'm a historian, not a political scientist. The
Right.
political scientist studies every time that nothing changed. Which part of this story is completely every day that the next day happens and it's exactly like this day can be explained by political science and social science. History is the story of all the things that we couldn't predict that ended up happening because human beings are weird. And was it Popeye who used to say, "That's all I can stands, and I can't stands no more"?
Yeah, I think so.
You can't really know for, let's say, 150 million Americans when they hit that moment where they say, "That's all I can stand, and I can't stand no more."
Huh.
And as a historian, I know that it's coming, but I don't know when it's coming. The
Well,
the
okay.
safe
Let me
bet is
ask it
to
this
predict that
way.
it's not happening tomorrow. But
Fine. Let me ask it in this way: that time for violence in society was more likely in the Revolutionary War and thereabout times than it is right now. Correct?
yeah,
And during the Civil War, clearly it was more violent than it is now, correct?
Yes.
How about the 60s? That was a pretty tumultuous time. Wasn't that pretty tough compared to how it is now?
Yes, but there
Okay.
are no I mean, and this is something that Martin Luther King Jr. had right. There are no problems in the American political system that can't be solved peacefully. That was true in the 1960s, and it's true today. Every one of these problems, and I'll kind of combine what Eisenhower said and um, King said, but these are all problems of the human heart. They're all problems of how we orient our values, and those are things that can all be fixed peacefully.
Okay. So you're an optimist still.
I hope so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm an optimist because I still think there, and this is something that Professor Bloodworth said, and I believe it's true, and I'm glad he reminded me of it. But there is still an American character that feels very strongly about justice, even if it can't elaborate
Huh.
exactly what it means.
I totally agree with that.
There is still this feeling among Americans of, hey, so this is wrong.
Fair play. It
Yeah,
just, yeah.
and
And that crosses party lines and
yeah, and I
demographics.
hope that character of America has saved us many times. But man, you got to keep teaching it. We're stretching the limits of the American character by kind of no longer teaching it, and we're relying on memories of memories.
But yeah.
And that,
Professor, I know the reason you're an optimist is you're still a Republican, aren't you?
yep.
Yeah, you think you can make a change within the party that you've been a member of your entire life.
Well, I think my
Yeah,
position
you
now
do.
is just mostly from stubbornness.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean,
It's mine. I was stubborn for
here's my
decades.
like American, like, and it's my party. You leave, you
I did
know.
that for 30 years. I
Like,
agree. I did that for 32 years, and then finally I said no thanks. Yeah.
yeah, but
Okay.
Jonah Goldberg had a column last week where he made this point with like, you know, eventually we're going to hit this line where enough people are saying we don't want you in the Republican Party, where I will just say like, all right, I got the message.
Yeah.
You hate me. You don't believe in anything that I believe in. You don't want my vote. You don't want my support. And eventually, enough of you are going to say this to me that I'm just going to believe you.
Yeah.
Um,
Millions of people have done that before you and before me. Yeah. So I get it.
but I'm
Um,
just like, it is. Are you really? It's such a bizarre conversation to have again with two people who are spent their entire lives begging people to vote. We used to be literally going around door to door saying, I'll do anything, please just vote for this, dumpy
I,
guy, who is not Thomas Jefferson, but I promise that America will be a better place if you vote for this dork. And now to have people, we're the people in the houses, and the guy's coming over to our house and saying, no matter what you do, we don't want your vote. And you're
yeah.
like, wow, politics has really changed.
It is really weird now, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, just don't make sure you don't give to Nikki Haley though, because you'll be limited forever, I guess. You'll
Yeah.
never be. Yeah. And yeah, it was a contemporary commentary. You've been busy, so you haven't been watching the news much, but that was yesterday's
Well,
news.
I mean, I caught the headlines and stuff. If
Yeah.
if she's still on the ballot by the time she comes around here, I'll vote for her.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I don't know what good it will do, but I'm not in the club, so I guess I
Yeah,
shouldn't care as much.
doesn't matter. Like, just do the right thing. I mean, I was thinking about, did we ever have Jeffrey Herf on this show?
No,
Uh,
but we need to.
we need to. Yeah.
I'll start. I'll work on that. He's a Facebook friend because of you. I'll
Yeah,
work
yeah.
on that.
And I keep thinking about some advice he gave to me in grad school. It was like a little minor controversy. And it was like one of those things that really stuck with me. And he just said, just always do the right thing. And then everything will always work out. And you'll never have to be ashamed of what we did,
Yeah, I love that.
And
Well, he stole that from Winston Churchill, though.
probably paraphrasing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great quote from Churchill. I love that. Always do right. and damn the consequences, except in matters of faith and common sense or something. Yeah.
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 Well, we were, I
Okay.
mean, yeah, anyway, but it stuck with me there that just then you won't have to ever. So if your ballot comes to you, look at it and say who would actually make the better, who would make the best president, and just vote for that person. Like, just do it. Like, and then you'll be fine.
Yeah.
But people
All
get up
right.
in their head like, oh, this person can't win, or I'm throwing my vote away, or like, no, we're past that point.
Or my
Just do the
tribe
right thing.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. We've gone a full hour, even though I started late. And so forgive me for talking too long. Andrea, Bart, or Rick, I don't know about the professor's time. He usually kind of winks at me if he's on his way out the door. But I think we've got a few minutes to ask questions or comments of anything you'd like. So just take yourself off mute. There you go, Andrea. You call yourself
Yeah,
Andy too. Um,
both. I have no preference. I like to
please,
be ambiguous. I
questions
have
or
a couple
comments for the
comments.
professor?
No, I have a couple comments. One is that one of the confounding things is it's so hard to imagine something different from what we grew up with and always thought. Like people just assumed that, of course, they were going to be ruled by kings, and then all of a sudden we had this idea, oh, we're going to rule ourselves. That kind of profound change is sometimes I think it builds up over a long period of time, and then all of a sudden it happens.
I agree 100%. Actually, that was in my notes to say that I never got around to saying. So thank you for making exactly the point that I actually have lack of imagination written down as one of the points I want to make. And I think that's what you're describing.
I have this feeling that there's something I can't understand, but I'm right on the edge of understanding it. There's some new principle that would make everything clear in my head, but I can't quite get to it, But part of it, I think, has to do with people just believe A is true or else B is true. Well, that's just too simple. It's, uh, if like, it's too simple to say, is America a great country or is it a horrible, evil country? Well, it's both. We've done wonderful things and we've done terrible things, and we can see that in our own selves. So why should it be any different with a conglomeration of people coming together to, it's just too simple.
Andrea,
simple to say this or it's that.
A question of you, by the way, and then go back to your main point, and Professor, you can react to it. I do tire of my Democratic friends who always seem to want to look at the bad, though. And they go, yeah, John, you're talking about the good and the opportunities, but what we got to talk about the bad. Until we talk about the bad, we can never move past this, and it kind of is insufferable to me. I just like, oh my gosh, do we have to go to if we're bad again? Okay, I know we're bad, or I know that happened, but do we have to talk about it again more? And they go, yes. I don't know what it is. Do you agree with that? That's a weird psychology. Am I the weird person or the Democrat? My liberal friends. What do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do, and I get tired of it too. Sometimes it's complicated. You know how people have this thing on their social media pages where they ask about a relationship and they say it's complicated. Yeah. Okay, I get that.
Yeah.
I think we need to do both. I don't think you can say either or. We have to look at the good frequently and we have to look at the bad frequently. And if you get tired of one or the other, it's probably because one is more comforting and the other is more discomforting that you get tired of looking at them. But I don't agree that you can't look at the good until you finish looking at the bad. I think you have to look at both, either simultaneously or rapidly switching between back and forth, between them.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Professor, reaction to that, and then we'll see if she has another question or comment.
She's absolutely right. And in terms of like the solutions we might have to deal with that, I just think we need to be better at understanding the story of how pluralism evolved, because we understand that we don't just have one value, we have many values. And one of the things that's really hard for people to understand is when I get to the part in the class and I say, our founding fathers wanted to make sure that no problem would ever be solved in America. And they say, what? Yeah, because solving a problem always involves some form of totalitarian violence. We can absolutely solve problems, but we just can't do it without hurting the rights of unpopular minorities and killing millions of people. Like, we're here to try to make things a little bit better, then come back next year. That's the system that we created. And then people say, oh, that's not good enough. Like, and then well, the reason people say that's not good enough is they don't understand the history of how we got to that part. And you know, when people now, the word liberalism is so sort of toxic, but I mean liberalism as it evolved in the American tradition and in Europe, right, in the larger. And there is a persistent anti-liberalism, because liberalism is one of these things that evolved out of us trying every one of these bad ideas that you're suggesting. And if you don't know that what you're suggesting is actually a terrible idea, you're going to keep suggesting it. And yeah, like, get a bunch of people who are just like me and give us everything and take away everything from everybody else. That's a very old idea, you know. You know, and it took us a long time to understand, tens of thousands of years of human history, to understand that what Lincoln said is true. The only thing that entwines itself about the human heart is liberty to all. And when I explain it to my students, I say, I use a metaphor of like a sports event or a, you know, or a game. The only way you'll know if you've won the game is if if everybody follows the rules. Because if I come out and say, hey, let's play a game of Monopoly, and then I shoot you in the head, how do I know if I'm better at Monopoly than you? You know. And here's the other thing about Monopoly: most of it's luck, right? Like, and we just all have to live in this imperfect world where sometimes somebody gets lucky. It's a little bit of hard work. It's a little bit who your parents are. It's a little bit of all this stuff. Acknowledge it all. Like, say, absolutely. Like, the reason I did this is probably because of this. And, you know, like, acknowledging the truth is not a weakness. And teaching people the history of how we got to the idea that what we need to do is negotiate between these many good ideas peacefully and come up with priorities that say, we're going to have to come back again next year and readjust. Because everything else that's going on in life is way too complicated. So stuff's going to, you know, next year we're going to have a flood, and then we're going to have flood insurance, you know, and that means that the priorities are going to have to change. You know, we're going to come up with earthquake codes for our houses, whatever, you know, no problem will ever be solved. Like, we're human beings. We can't create heaven on earth. You know?
Fascinating. Andrea, one last bite at the apple, since you're a fairly newcomer. I think you've been in some of our conversations, maybe on racism. But one last bite at the apple. You don't have to take it, but if you want to, the time's yours.
I, I think our life just doesn't prepare us for negotiating because we want a solution, you know, fast, and it should be our solution without stopping to think about.
Yes.
And some of our ideas are good and some of our ideas are bad, and other people, we can't just win and let other people lose. That's not going to work long run, you know.
Yeah.
But we just want a solution now, and that it just takes a long time, and it's hard to negotiate with people who have other needs than yours, other opinions than yours.
Yeah, but there's so much wisdom in that too. I think that it's one of the things that I have learned in getting some of this gray hair is how much I learn by listening to people who have real disagreements with me, and then seeing how the final product of what we produce is better than what I would have come up with on my own. and
And what they would have come up with on their own.
yeah, well, I hope so. Yeah, but you have to live through that before you really see, oh no, I want people who honestly believe something different. Like I want them to disagree with me. They're doing me a favor.
Yeah. Helpful. Andrea, thank you for joining us today.
You bet.
Rick, it's been a while since you've joined us. Do you have any questions or comments, or should we go to Bart to almost finish this out? Rick, take yourself off mic. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, just a quick comment. In general, I've been surprised and disappointed how little many people know about how the government is supposed to run. Separation of powers, how bill becomes law, how elections run, role of the president. But recently, I was reading an article about a professor who was teaching at one of our national war colleges. So he was teaching the colonels and captains who were coming up the line and were the best and the brightest, and he too was stunned at how little people in these roles, people who were well educated, interested in the government, had taken an oath to protect the Constitution, and how little they knew about our government. I worry since the foundation of, I think, all freedom is based on education and knowledge, if it's not being taught anymore, or if it is so far off the agenda to teach that sort of basic truth, I do wonder or worry what all this might lead to. Professor, I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Yes, I agree. And Professor Brasino, the guy I was mentioning earlier, he is a professor at War College. I wonder if it was him, but I don't think it was him who said it. But generally speaking, his students are pretty amazing. I mean, they're sharp guys. But you're right. What's missing is kind of the basics. It's really weird. I used to point to this pyramid of knowledge. It wasn't Maslow's hierarchy, but I used to point at it and say everybody wants to skip the part at the bottom. They all want to leap to critical thinking, and they want to put into legislation like critical thinking. And I'm always saying, critical thinking about what? You have to know something first. Everybody thinks they can just look stuff up on their phones, but in order to actually think critically, some stuff has to be in your head first, and then you can think about it. You can't think about information that's being held in your phone. You have to put it in your brain and mull it over and think about what it means for a long time. So I think Rick's absolutely right.
Last comment, Rick. Are you good? Sounds like he's good. Bart, you're up.
Yeah, I agree with everything everybody's been saying this morning. I think getting back to John, what you started out this conversation about, which is kind of like, what is a citizen, a perplexed citizen supposed to do? And I think what we're supposed to do is exactly what we're doing here. We got to keep talking. And we do have to keep learning. I think Professor Tootle is right too. I think, we can't stop teaching the actual facts of things. And I think we have gotten away from that, and Professor, I actually sympathize with, my really, really liberal friends are going to like cringe when I say this, but as a member of the Colorado Bar Association, I'm responsible every year for taking a certain number of DEI credits, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's funny because I take them and I kind of go, whatever, it's part of my ethics requirement. The problem is the last couple of them I've taken, there's nothing to take away from those programs, I'm finding. Mm-hmm. It's basically someone telling me how I'm supposed to think about something. And I don't know that you can ever really make someone think a certain way about something. You can advocate for them to think a certain way about something, but you have to persuade them. And I think that, the problem you have with DEI, and it's kind of a problem I have too, is that I think in some ways it's making minority relations in this country worse, because the main purpose of DEI seems to be to make everybody really conscious of all of our differences. And then to sort of like walk out of the room and pretend that we're all not going to try to kill each other after that.
Yeah.
And what they don't understand is that we all have to live together, you know, and
Study
that's
after
the major
study
objective.
has demonstrated that like DEI trainings don't do anything, and DEI instructions make things worse. Like, because I don't know if these people really thought about this, but what they're doing is giving the majority of people in the United States a racial consciousness and having them think about themselves as as belonging to a particular race. And that's not going to that doesn't end up well. That doesn't go well.
Well, and there is a place and a time to be conscious of all of that. I mean,
Right.
I'm a member of a minority group. I'm Jewish, okay? I'm not of color or anything like that. But I distinctly know, in fact, that it's something I've known all of my life, that I'm a little bit different.
Yeah.
Well, I still have to live in the rest of the world, even though I'm a little bit different.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. And
Yeah. I mean, again, it all goes back to the 49ers locker room, but the genius of Kyle Shanahan is that Deebo Samuel gets to be himself, that Trent Williams gets to be himself, and what we can still create a positive culture and atmosphere for everybody while still respecting the differences between people. But you got to kind of do both. You can't just say, hey, let's get into a classroom and do nothing but emphasize the fact that you two are different people and that that's the most important thing, and then expect them to go out on the football field and play together. Like that's I don't know, that just seems so bizarre as a desired outcome. Like the idea, as it is in the California ethnic studies curriculum for K-12 education, that something positive will come out of indoctrinating students in specifically their racial identity. Now, I'm not saying, I mean, this again came up, and I was like, do you really think that there's a history professor in the world who doesn't know that racism existed in the United States and that it does still exist in the United States? Can you find one? Can we find one job candidate who would actually deny that the Civil War took place? I mean, this, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills when I'm answering these questions. But what I disagree with is the part where you say you have to take these bad ideas from the past and you have to put them in your heart. You're like, what? I don't want to believe what a racist believed in the 19th century. Why are you making me do that?
mm-hmm.
And then I have to hire people who say that I have to make someone a 21st century racist, and that if I don't go along with you when you want to create 21st century racists, that I'm the bad guy. Like, this is like that line from Anchorman, where he says, "I'm Ron Burgundy," like with a question mark at the end of it. Like
So, Professor, I do have to take a jab at us. You and I both have said that we're hoping to vote for Nikki Haley, if she's still in the race. I don't mean to pile on to her, but what the heck is that pressure that she answered so stupidly? I mean, what seriously? We're both voting for that answer. What the heck was that about? Why are we in this crazy town, USA?
I make no statement other than if you are forcing me to vote for either Donald Trump or Nikki Haley, I'm voting for Nikki Haley in the
Okay,
primary.
all right, fair
Like
enough.
I will defend
mhm.
nothing about her.
Okay, fair enough. I actually like her more than that, but okay, fair enough. I get it. Let me plant a seed with all of us here today. Um, in fact, I have occasionally I wake up and think horrors that could happen in America, and not from foreign terrorists, although I have those things as well, but internally strife. I some consideration towards that. I am comforted though that I served in the military, and it wasn't when I was an officer in college in ROTC. It was when I was enlisted at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. It's called something else, I think. But I every single private in the military, every single cop and fireman, every single county commissioner and city council person, every postman and woman were sworn to protect the Constitution, not a family, not a Republican or Democratic or liberal or conservative idea. They're sworn to protect the Constitution. And now, do they all understand it? Do they all think through it? No, of course not. But they have the opportunity to remember what they swore to, and they can be reminded by others that may have an idea. Their boss or colleagues or the people they work for can say, "Hey, think about this," and that brings me comfort that America is probably better off than we think it's going to be. That we're all
and in a
swore an
yeah,
idea.
right. And in a practical sense, you're absolutely right. I mean, you want to see what this looks like? Yeah, a bunch of people opposed the integration of schools. Let's call it the 82nd Airborne. Like here's some facts from history that you should no mob or group of terrorists can stand up to actual soldiers who are trained as actual soldiers. I mean, there are things that the Army can do. I mean, military training, there is no substitute for it. And the way that our Army and our services work is pretty darn good at standing up to housewives with opinions on TikTok. But that's not to say that terrorists can't engage in acts of violence that would be horrific. But in terms of being able to actually put up some form of military force that our military couldn't handle, I mean, come on, that's
and internal to the military too. I'm fully aware. This sounds controversial, but I am just intimately aware about how conservative most members of the Army are. I don't know if it's 2/3 or 3/4. I truly don't know, but it's a majority. It's at least 51 are generally conservative and generally pro-gun and generally patriotic and generally, but not everybody. I was really surprised that there's a huge diversion of thought in the military.
certainly among
And
enlisted.
and they're all sworn to uphold the Constitution, not what the company commander says, or not what the drill sergeant says, or not what the president of the United States says. They all have to follow legal orders, and that tension, checks and balances of every single person sworn to uphold an idea. Now, if they're wrong, they go to Leavenworth or jail. But if they're right, they're a hero, and they get put in the history books, and they have to think through that ethical dilemma. I love that about America. So I have more comfort than many that we're going to be okay.
I think Rick wanted to say something.
Recently, until very recently, there was a senator from Alabama that was holding up hundreds of appointments of military officers. I understand there's been a breakthrough, but I had read at the time that this could be conceivably somewhat intentional to allow these positions to be open until a nefarious president was elected, and that person might appoint people who were more flexible in their morals and ethics and might not serve the Constitution the way previous military leaders have. I don't know where that stands, but I think there's still quite a backlog.
No, I think it's all over now. I think they voted both. They did a mass one, and then they individually went through all the generals, didn't they? I think that's completely over, isn't it?
I didn't hear that. No, but I could be wrong. Or maybe I'm not up to date.
I'll put out a post on that. That's a simple Google search. I remember the news story on it, Rick, but maybe I'm wrong on a couple of the generals or something.
There's really only one long-term cultural issue, and we need to have Tom back on here, Professor Brasino, to address this. But in the last, say, 70, 50 years, there's been this rise in people saying you don't fight for ideals, you fight for the guy next to you. And that's become a pretty common thing to say. I worry a little bit about that. I mean, I get it in a practical sense, but I also want to make sure that we understand that the United States military exists so that the United States can continue to be an example to the rest of the world that human beings can govern themselves. And that's why the military needs to be here. There is a larger patriotic purpose in the military beyond fighting for the person who's next to you.
Yeah, and Professor, I'm not the subject matter expert on this. I assume there's some Army psychologist that is. Yeah, there are jobs about that study these things. I will tell you though, I was in the personnel department of the National Guard in Colorado, and my job was to travel to all the armories around the state, and which was just fascinating. I mean, you actually schedule the rotation in Rifle and even Grand Junction and all the mountain towns. Oh, you
Parachute.
don't. Oh yeah, yeah. You don't go there in hunting season, where they're not going to go through their personal records in hunting season because they're not going to be there for drill. And that cultural phenomenon, I get. I don't mess with somebody's Second Amendment rights in the Army in the mountains of Colorado and a bunch of other places around the country.
Yeah.
But having said some of those stereotypes, I'm telling you, I think people take their oath of office very seriously. I really do. Even the privates and even backwards non-college. I'm telling you, I think. And do they have very firm opinions on all sorts of stuff? Oh yeah. But they also realize there's a checks and balances in that, because you're going to plant an insurrection or something. You got to tell somebody to do it. You ain't doing it on your own. And every other person you tell is also sworn an oath to the Constitution, not to their buddy. Not to the commander in chief, to the Constitution. And that brings me tremendous, not that there can't be crazy people doing all sorts of crazy stuff, but
Yeah.
large scale.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, and hopefully in our lifetimes, I'll never be proven wrong on that. Okay. Anyone else or Professor, thank you so much for your time. I do think we all have to do a better job in this year, in 2024. I think there's some really troubling signs. And I think we all have to be smarter than we currently are. I just think we have to be more passionate and more thoughtful with each other, because we're doing some stupid stuff as a society. So let's fix that permanently, where we never have to do it again, right?
Absolutely.
No, you don't mean that.
Oh
We
wait,
can't.
no problem
Right.
is solved there.
Right.
See how easy it is to fall into it? Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Thank you all for joining us today, Professor. Thanks for your time. Enjoy the weekend and next week. Hopefully we'll be next Friday, right?
Right on. I don't know. I haven't looked at my calendar,
Yeah.
but yeah, hopefully.
Have a great day, y'all. Thanks,
All right.
Bart. Bye.